This morning we encounter two processions. One is going out of the town of Nain, and the other is coming in. Nain is a town in the south of Galilee, a short distance from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. At the head of the procession going into Nain is Jesus. The procession coming out is led by a coffin. What will happen when these two processions cross paths at the town gate? Which one is going to give way? Jesus sees the grieving mother, and what does he do? How does he respond? His heart went out to her. He feels compassion for her. Jesus chooses to share in her sorrow. Moved by compassion, Jesus then acts. "Young man, I say to you, get up," he shouts. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. The compassion of Jesus led to something amazing happening, something unexpected. Death was trampled down by the Lord of life. And this is our Christian hope. Through Jesus Christ, death, our ancient enemy, has been cast down and trampled underfoot. Death has been swallowed up in victory. We no longer have to live in fear of death. But sometimes we do anyway, don't we? It's difficult not to fear death. And I'm not just talking about physical death. We die many little deaths throughout our lives. Many of the changes we face often feel like a little death. We grieve the loss of the familiar. We long to relive the days of our past. But the reality is, if we are to continue to grow, we must accept these little deaths. We must allow ourselves to be transformed into the full stature of Christ. And for that to happen, we have to let go of some of the baggage we've been dragging around. Some of those old grudges, some of those past regrets, some of those character flaws. They are aspects of ourselves that we have to allow to just die. In our epistle lesson, Paul speaks about his earlier life, about when he was violently persecuting the Christian church, trying to destroy it. You may recall that when St. Stephen was stoned to death, it was Paul, then called Saul, who held the coats so the men could throw the stones better. When Paul encountered Christ on the road to Damascus, he was transformed. But that transformation required a little death. Saul, the zealous persecutor of the church, had to die. Now, congregations have to pass through these little deaths as well if they are to be transformed and continue to follow the call of God. I served as an interim priest a few times. As an interim, you're assigned to a church to serve in a congregation while they make their transition from one spiritual leader to another. I kind of like being an interim, to be honest with you. You had 5 tasks to accomplish. You were only there for a year. There was no popularity contest. And after a year, they threw you a little party and you left. You know, really kind of nice and simple. But sometimes the former priest was the beloved rector. And sometimes he or she was not quite so beloved. In either case, there was some element of a grieving process going on in those congregations, and interims were required to allow that process to unfold naturally and to attend any pastoral needs that might result from it. It was only when the congregation faced that particular chapter of their common life was over that they could begin to dream about the future. There had to be a little death before there could be any room for new life. Sometimes we fear these little deaths so much that I think we're a bit too cautious. We hesitate to do anything new, anything risky. I mean, after all, what if we fail? What if there isn't enough? What if we make a mistake? We stick to the familiar. We stick to the comfortable because we're afraid of dying. Barbara Brown Taylor, an author and an Episcopal priest, wrote a thoughtful article in the Christian Century entitled "The Poured Out Church." I want to share part of it with you. When I consider my life of faith, this world is clearly where my transformation has taken place. It is in the world that I have met the people who have changed me. Some of them believers, but far more of them not. People who have loved me, fought me, shamed me, forgiven me, sanding down my edges on one side while they broke whole ragged chunks of me off the other. The world is where I have been struck dumb by beauty, by cruelty, by human invention and greed. The world is where my notions of God have been destroyed, reformed, chastened, redeemed. The world is where I have occasionally been good for something and where I have done irreparable harm. The reason I know this, however, is that the church has given me the eyes with which I see, as well as the words with which I speak. The church has given me a community in which to figure out what has happened to me in the world. It has given me a place to love and grieve within a tradition far older and wiser than I. It is the church that has poured me into the world. In other words, which is counterintuitive. How can a church survive that keeps pouring itself into the world? I cannot possibly say. All I know is the gospel truth. Those willing to give everything away are the ones with anything worth keeping. Those willing to look at death full in the face are the ones with the most abundant lives. Go figure. Those willing to look death full in the face are the ones with the most abundant lives. Can we look death full in the face? Are we willing to pour ourselves into the world? Will we risk much for the sake of the gospel? We can, and we will, because we are Christians. Because we do not live in fear of death. Because we are those who proclaim the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not suggesting we be foolish. There is a difference between being bold and risking much and being foolish. We are certainly called to be good stewards of the gifts God has given us. But we must always remember that our mission field is out there in the world. And to be effective witnesses for God, we must pour ourselves into the world, even if it seems risky, even if it seems deadly. How do we know where to pour ourselves out? In this morning's gospel, when those two processions met, one led by life and one led by death, it was at the moment that Jesus was filled with compassion for the widow that everything was transformed. Life overcame death. Mourning was transformed into laughter and joy. This transformation began with compassion, with Jesus opening his heart to the grief of the mother. Where do we begin to pour ourselves out? In those places where people are hurting, and those places where we find ourselves moved to open our hearts and to reveal the compassion of Christ. Let us always remember that we do not exist for the sake of the church. We exist for the sake of the world. We are called to pour ourselves out, driven by compassion for those who are hurting in this world. If that means we have to look death full in the face, so be it. Cannot God raise up something new from the ashes of our broken dreams? Let us not live in the fear of death, or the little deaths that each of us face every day. Let us walk together with Christ in our midst and be willing to risk much for the sake of the world, and to proclaim with our every word and our every deed the transformative power of God's love.